Good evening, my dreaming souls. Tonight, we journey back to a time of shadows, silence, and sorrow. A time when the world changed forever. From 1347 to 1351, a devastating force swept across continents, leaving no corner of life untouched. It was known as the Black Death, a plague that claimed millions, reshaped societies, and carved deep scars into the memory of civilization. But within that darkness, there are stories of survival, of resilience, and of the strange beauty that emerges when the world stands still. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the past. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Let us know in the comments below. Now dim your lights, take a slow, steady breath, and allow yourself to relax. We're about to step quietly into a time when fear ruled the streets, but history whispered its lessons in every silent breath. Let the past speak as we drift into the haunting echoes of the Black Death. It did not begin with a bang or a trumpet blast. It began quietly, almost like a whisper carried by the wind across the sea. In the year 1347, a handful of ships arrived in Sicily. They drifted into the harbor of Messina, battered and strange, and brought with them the most devastating pandemic in human history. The sailors aboard were either already dead or dying, their bodies covered in strange black swellings, and their breath thick with fever. The townspeople, curious as ever, came closer to investigate. Within days, they were falling sick themselves. It is always the curious ones who go first. This was not the first time disease had swept through the world, of course. Ancient Rome had its plagues, as did Byzantium and the great empires of the East. But what was coming now was something different. Something darker. It would not just take a few thousand lives. It would take millions. Somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population would vanish in just a few years. Whole villages would disappear. Cities would be left hollow. The smell of death would become more familiar than the scent of bread. But before all that, we must go back to where it started. The disease most likely began far to the east, somewhere near the steppes of Central Asia, where Mongol traders and warriors crossed vast distances on horseback, connecting distant cultures through roads, silk, and sadly, rats. The Mongol Empire, with all its destruction and glory, had also created the world's first massive trade network. From China to Persia, from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, goods moved faster than ever. And where goods move, stowaways often follow. Among those stowaways were fleas, tiny ones, the kind that made their homes on rats, which made their homes on ships, which in turn made their way into every port city along the Silk Road. The fleas carried a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, a name that sounds like a Roman senator but acts more like a demon. When the fleas bit, they passed on the bacteria, and the bacteria did not mess around. It moved fast, swelling lymph nodes into painful black buboes, causing fevers, chills, vomiting, and in many cases, death within just a few days. Now, to be fair to the bacteria, it was not trying to cause a global crisis. It was just trying to survive like all organisms do. But in its desperate climb up the food chain, it happened to tear a hole in the fabric of society that would not fully heal for centuries. When the disease reached the Crimean city of Kaffa in 1347, something almost cinematic happened. The city was under siege by Mongol forces. During the siege, the attackers started dying in large numbers. Instead of retreating, the Mongols made what might be the world's first recorded case of biological warfare. They loaded the dead bodies of their own infected soldiers into catapults and hurled them over the city walls. Imagine being a medieval defender standing on the ramparts when a bloated corpse comes sailing over the parapets and lands with a thud. You might start reconsidering your life choices. The people of Kaffa fled. Some escaped by sea, bringing the disease with them into ports like Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, and eventually through the veins of Europe. Once it arrived, it moved like fire on dry grass. There was no stopping it. Europe at this time was not exactly prepared for a health crisis. The cities were crowded, sanitation was minimal, and doctors were, shall we say, more enthusiastic than effective. Their medical knowledge was a mix of ancient theory, astrology, and creative guesswork. Most people believed disease was caused by bad air or unbalanced bodily humors. Bleeding, purging, and the use of sweet-smelling herbs were common treatments. If you were lucky, you got chamomile tea. If you were unlucky, you got a hole drilled in your head. As the disease spread, people noticed the symptoms followed a grim pattern. It started with a fever, chills, and exhaustion. Then came the swellings, usually in the armpits, neck, or groin, that turned black and painful. These were the infamous buboes. Within days, victims either died or were left scarred and shaken. And just to keep things interesting, there were multiple forms of the disease. The bubonic version was terrible. The pneumonic version, which attacked the lungs, was worse. And the septicemic form, which entered the blood directly, was essentially a death sentence. You could go to bed feeling a bit unwell and never wake up. The terror this caused is hard to describe. People watched their neighbors die, their friends, their families. Funeral processions turned into death parades. Graves filled faster than they could be dug. In many towns, the bodies were left in the streets or piled into mass pits. The living could barely keep up with the dead. Priests stopped administering last rites. Doctors fled their patients. Parents abandoned their children. In some cities, cats and dogs outnumbered humans by the end of the outbreak. And yet, life went on in a strange, stumbling way. Bakers still tried to bake. Tailors still mended clothes. Monks still copied manuscripts, often coughing as they did. Humor, dark and dry, began to surface. People wrote poems and sang songs about the plague. One English rhyme from the time goes, "Ring-a-ring-a-roses, a pocket full of posies. It ends badly, as you might imagine." But people laughed too, because what else could they do? Even in the worst moments of fear and despair, the human mind seeks meaning, seeks story, and sometimes even seeks a punchline. A man might joke that his neighbor's breath was worse than the plague itself. A woman might roll her eyes at a preacher blaming dancing for divine punishment. It was gallows humor, yes, but it kept people human. The first wave of the plague from 1347 to 1351 swept through most of Europe like a storm, but we are only at the beginning of the story. In the coming parts, we will look at how the plague spread through different regions, what daily life looked like amid death, how religion and fear intertwined, how society buckled and changed, and what strange, tragic, and even absurd things happened along the way. This was not just a medical disaster. It was a social earthquake. And somehow, in the rubble, people kept living. Just slightly more cautiously, and maybe with fewer hugs. The plague was not picky. It did not care if you were rich or poor, a nobleman or a fisherman, a bishop or a beggar. Once it landed in Europe, it moved with unsettling efficiency, touching every corner of society like an unwanted guest that refused to leave. And it did not stroll in politely. It galloped. After arriving by ship in Messina in the autumn of 1347, the disease spread rapidly through the Italian peninsula. Cities like Genoa and Venice were soon overwhelmed. From there, it followed trade routes northward and westward, hitching rides on carts, horses, and yes, more ships. Rats and fleas were the uninvited passengers, hidden in barrels of grain, baskets of cloth, and the cracks between floorboards. By the time people started realizing what was happening, it was already too late. The Mediterranean coast was the first to feel the full weight of the plague. Cities that had once bustled with life and commerce fell quiet. In Marseille, the dead outnumbered the living so quickly that bodies were thrown into empty houses or dumped into pits without ceremony. Barcelona, another great trading port, was struck with such speed that entire neighborhoods were abandoned within days. People ran, but there was nowhere to run to. The plague was always one step ahead. From Italy and Spain, the disease crept into France and then into England by the summer of 1348. It likely arrived in England through the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. As with most outbreaks, it came by sea, with ships docking quietly, bringing goods and a little something extra. The local population had no idea that a catastrophe was about to unfold. By the end of the year, it had reached London. Now, London was not exactly a beacon of sanitation in the best of times. The streets were narrow, crowded, and often layered with waste. Open sewers ran through neighborhoods, and refuse was tossed from windows with an alarming lack of concern for what might be below. One can only imagine the conversation, "Look out below," followed by something unpleasant. So when the plague arrived, it found the city to be a most accommodating host. Within weeks, the capital was in chaos. Death carts trundled through the streets, collecting bodies by the dozens. Churchyards filled quickly. Gravediggers, one of the few professions in high demand, could not keep up. Some people tried to escape the city, but in doing so, they brought the plague to the countryside. It was like trying to put out a fire by blowing on it. And blow they did. The disease spread across England with terrifying speed. By early 1349, it had reached York, then Newcastle, then the Scottish border. Meanwhile, it crossed into Germany, Switzerland, and the Low Countries. Flanders, with its dense population and bustling textile trade, was hit especially hard. The disease passed through the cities like a scythe, cutting down thousands. Monasteries were decimated. Some towns were reduced to a fraction of their original population. By the spring of 1350, the plague reached Scandinavia. It traveled across the North Sea into Norway, where a ship docked in Bergen with a crew already dead or dying. Within weeks, the disease had taken hold. From there, it crept eastward into Sweden and then Finland. Even the cold northern climate could not stop it. In the east, the plague moved into Poland and Hungary, although these areas were hit slightly less severely. Some speculate that local responses, sparser populations, and perhaps sheer luck played a role. Though rumors of a king sealing his borders might sound like medieval public health policy, in practice it was often too little, too late. Fleas are terrible listeners. The disease also followed the Danube River, making its way into Austria and the Balkans. In Constantinople, still a shadow of its former glory, the plague caused widespread devastation. The Eastern Roman Empire, now mostly centered around that ancient city, was already politically fragile. The arrival of the plague only added to its instability. By 1351, the disease had swept through most of the known world. France, Germany, the British Isles, Scandinavia, and much of Central and Southern Europe were reeling. The speed was terrifying, and it was not just the cities that suffered. Rural areas, where one might have thought distance would provide safety, were hit too. Traveling monks, merchants, soldiers, and refugees spread the disease from village to village. The rats and fleas were tireless. Many villages simply vanished. The records stopped. The church bells went silent. The fields grew wild. In some places, when the tax collectors came years later, they found nothing but crumbling homes and overgrown paths. The people were gone, and no one had come to take their place. And yet, as grim as it all sounds, there were moments that bordered on the absurd. In France, some nobles took to locking themselves in their manors with their favorite wines, hoping to wait the plague out in style. Others tried to outdrink the disease. One Parisian reportedly drank only crushed emeralds mixed with wine. Needless to say, this was not the miracle cure he hoped for. In Italy, masks filled with flowers or sponges soaked in vinegar were worn in hopes of filtering out the bad air. The logic was not sound, but the commitment was admirable. In England, one group of folk tried moving their beds outdoors, thinking the fresh air might help. Others beat drums or rang bells to scare the sickness away. A few people even blamed cats and killed them en masse, which, in a twist of cruel irony, only made the rat problem worse. A classic case of medieval overreaction, really. Not all reactions were misguided, though. Some towns attempted quarantine, closing their gates and refusing entry to outsiders. A few, such as Milan, took the drastic step of sealing entire houses if someone inside showed symptoms. It was brutal, but in some cases it worked. Milan was one of the few large cities to suffer less severely than others. When you are up against an invisible killer, sometimes extreme caution becomes strategy. Despite the horror, life somehow continued. Farmers still sowed crops, if fewer of them. Carpenters still built coffins, albeit at an alarming pace. Children still played, though sometimes in smaller groups, and while the churches echoed with sorrow, they also became centers of comfort for those trying to make sense of the chaos. The Black Death had made its sweep, and it was not done yet. But in its wake, it left more than just graves. It left fear, yes, but also questions. People began to ask not just how the disease had spread, but why it had happened at all. And soon, those questions would turn into suspicion. Because when people get scared and confused, they do what they have always done. They look for someone to blame. That story, however, is for the next part. While the plague moved faster than any army, cutting down kings and cobblers alike, life in the midst of it carried on, if you could call it living. For most people, the world shrank down to a few questions: who had died, who was next, and whether there was any bread left in the village. The Black Death did not pause for anyone's plans. It did not care if a wedding had been scheduled or a festival prepared. It brought everything to a halt, and it made people see the familiar in strange, unsettling ways. In a world where religion and community shaped nearly every corner of daily life, The sudden disappearance of both left people shaken. Markets closed, churches emptied, schools vanished. The clamor of city life was replaced by an eerie quiet, interrupted only by coughing, prayers, or the clatter of carts collecting the dead. If you walked through a city like Florence or Paris during the worst of it, you might pass entire streets with doors shut, windows boarded, and the smell of sickness drifting through the air. Those who could afford to flee the cities often did. The wealthy retreated to country estates, hoping distance would save them. This did not always work, of course. One man in Siena left the city only to die days later in his garden, surrounded by freshly planted herbs that did absolutely nothing. Others brought their servants along, only to find out that death did not mind following a well-dressed crowd. For those who stayed behind by choice or necessity, daily life became a mix of survival and superstition. People burned herbs in their homes, hung sprigs of lavender or rosemary over their doors, and sprinkled vinegar on the floor in hopes of purifying the air. Physicians, if they could still be found, walked the streets in long robes and strange beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs. They looked less like doctors and more like characters from a slightly confused masquerade ball. The medical advice of the day varied wildly depending on which book a doctor owned or which direction the wind was blowing. Some recommended avoiding bathing altogether, as it was believed that warm water opened the pores and allowed bad air to enter. Others claimed that laughter was the best defense. There were even a few who insisted that listening to pleasant music could realign the humors of the body. You can imagine how that worked out. Among the more desperate responses were the flagellants. These were groups of men who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in a show of repentance. They believed the plague was a punishment from God, and that their suffering might convince the heavens to be merciful. Townsfolk would gather to watch, some in tears, others in awe. Occasionally, children joined the marches, beating themselves with sticks until someone sent them home. It was all quite dramatic, and probably not especially hygienic. The mood on the streets ranged from quiet dread to complete hysteria. In some places, families locked themselves indoors and refused to come out for weeks. In others, people danced in the streets in defiance of the sickness, convinced that joy could drive out death. Some taverns remained open, serving beer to crowds who figured that if they were going to die, they might as well enjoy one last pint. There are accounts of people throwing feasts beside plague pits, as if thumbing their noses at the inevitable. And yet, for every strange story, there were 10 of heartbreak. Entire families gone within days, mothers digging graves for their own children, priests collapsing in the middle of sermons, farmers leaving their plows in the fields to gather dust. In many cases, the bonds that held society together simply unraveled. People stopped visiting neighbors. Friends stopped shaking hands. Doors were marked with chalk or crosses to warn of infection inside. Suspicion hung in the air thicker than the plague itself. The social structure also began to crack. With so many dead, especially among the laboring class, a strange kind of chaos took hold. Fields went unharvested. Workshops fell silent. In some towns, bakers and blacksmiths were so few that people offered double, even triple pay just to get bread or tools. A few clever individuals saw this as an opportunity and switched trades entirely. There is one record of a pig farmer in England who, seeing a shortage of gravediggers, became one and made more money in 6 weeks than he had in 6 years. though one suspects it was not a long-term career move. Religion offered comfort to many, but it also brought questions. Why would God allow this? Why the children, the monks, the poor? Some clung more tightly to faith, while others began to drift. Attendance at Mass in some areas dropped not only from fear, but from doubt. The Church struggled to respond, losing thousands of clergy to the disease. Bishops died. Entire monasteries were emptied. Funerals became rushed or skipped altogether. For a religion so focused on the rituals of death and salvation, this disruption cut deeply. Still, for every crumbling church, there was a family praying together at home. For every silent city street, there was a small group gathering to sing psalms or share what food they had left. Humanity did not disappear. It adapted, sometimes beautifully, sometimes terribly. Art, too, began to change. In cities that still supported painters and poets, the tone shifted dramatically. Death was no longer a distant idea. It became the centerpiece. Skulls, skeletons, and hourglasses began appearing in paintings and carvings. Dances of death scenes of skeletons leading people from every walk of life to the grave became common themes. These were not only dark images, they were reminders of the shared fate of rich and poor, king and peasant, a quiet kind of democracy written in bone. And yet, people laughed, even in the worst of it. They joked about their neighbors' herbal remedies. They rolled their eyes at city officials who still tried to collect taxes. They told stories of plague victims coming back to scold those who took their shoes. Humor became survival, a way of softening a world that had grown too sharp. So life continued, unsteady, trembling, dark around the edges, but not gone. The worst of the first wave would eventually pass, though it would leave scars no one could ignore. And soon, fear would give way to blame, because when the storm fades, people look for explanations. They look for someone to point a finger at, and in the case of the Black Death, those fingers began to turn toward the people who looked or prayed differently. That shadow would be long and cruel. But we will go there next. By the time the plague had woven its black thread through towns and villages across Europe, the questions had changed. No longer were people simply asking, "What is happening?" or "When will it end?" Now, many were asking, "Who is to blame?" It is a very human reaction. When the world spins out of control, people search for a reason. They search for someone to point to. And in the case of the Black Death, fear began to shape that answer in dangerous ways. At first, the explanations were as wide-ranging as they were imaginative. Some believed the stars were at fault. A rare planetary alignment in the year 1345 was widely blamed for corrupting the air, turning it foul and poisonous. Astrologers and scholars issued warnings that the heavens had grown angry, which, to be fair, probably felt accurate at the time. Others believed the air itself had been poisoned. The term miasma became common, a bad vapor, drifting invisibly across the land, seeping into the lungs of the innocent. People burned herbs and spices, not just for the smell, but as a defense against this toxic mist. Some walked around with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar. Others carried pomanders, little balls filled with fragrant ingredients, like cloves or cinnamon, hoping sweet smells would drive out sickness. It was perfume as armor, and while it did not work, it did make everything smell a little less like a graveyard. But as the plague dragged on and more bodies piled up, the search for a scapegoat took a darker turn. In many parts of Europe, rumors began to circulate that certain groups were poisoning wells. These rumors, of course, had no foundation in truth, but when people are frightened, logic often goes missing. The most common targets of these accusations were Jewish communities. In cities and towns across France, Germany, and Switzerland, Jews were accused of causing the plague on purpose, poisoning water, casting spells, or working in secret to destroy Christian society. This was not a new prejudice. Anti-Jewish sentiment had long existed in medieval Europe, rooted in economic envy, religious tension, and sheer ignorance. But now that prejudice was inflamed by fear and desperation. In Strasbourg in the year 1349, long before the plague had even reached the city, officials rounded up hundreds of Jewish residents. They were offered a grim choice: convert to Christianity or die. Many refused. On February 14th, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive in the city's Jewish quarter. Their homes were looted, their synagogues destroyed. The plague had not even touched Strasbourg yet. The panic had arrived first. Other cities followed suit. In Mainz, Cologne, Erfurt, and dozens of smaller towns, Jewish communities were attacked and destroyed. People who had lived side by side for generations were suddenly treated as enemies. And even in places where local leaders tried to stop the violence, as some bishops and lords genuinely did, the mobs often acted on their own, driven by rumor and rage. This wave of persecution became one of the most tragic and overlooked consequences of the Black Death. Entire communities were erased. Families fled east toward Poland and Lithuania, where rulers were more tolerant, at least for a time. Others went into hiding, abandoning centuries-old homes. What began as a health crisis quickly became a moral one, and in some ways it revealed the deep fractures already present in medieval society. Fear had a way of spreading even faster than the plague itself. In some regions, strangers were viewed with suspicion just for traveling from another town. Merchants were turned away from markets. Beggars were beaten. Priests who did not pray in the correct way were accused of bringing divine punishment. And while not everyone joined the hysteria, enough people did to leave scars that would last far beyond the plague years. At the same time, the church faced its own crisis. Many of the faithful had turned to the church for answers, but those answers were not always forthcoming. When priests died in great numbers, and they did, because many remained at the bedsides of the sick, there were not enough clergy to go around. Sacraments were missed, funerals were rushed or ignored. Some monasteries lost half their population in a matter of weeks. And when churches closed or fell silent, people began to wonder, had God turned away? Some religious figures tried to offer explanations. They preached that the plague was punishment for sin, for vanity, pride, greed, or even dancing. Yes, dancing. Several sermons from this time specifically blame public dancing and lewd behavior for inciting divine wrath. It is probably safe to say they were not invited to many parties. But there were also those who offered comfort. Some priests stayed behind when others fled, giving last rites, offering food, or simply sitting beside the dying. These small acts of compassion, often forgotten in larger histories, were moments of quiet resistance against fear. They reminded people that mercy still had a place in the world, even when hope seemed thin. Among the general population, responses varied wildly. Some people grew more devout, attending Mass daily, fasting, and wearing amulets etched with sacred names. Others turned away from faith altogether, deciding that if the world could fall apart so suddenly, then perhaps none of it meant anything. This spiritual disillusionment would shape the years ahead in ways no one yet understood. But not all responses were spiritual or violent. Some people simply coped in whatever way they could. They made jokes. They carved strange faces into the walls of churches. They told stories about ghost ships and invisible demons. There is even a surviving account of a man in Florence who dressed up as a doctor, walked into the homes of the sick, and declared them healed just to see the look on their faces. Not helpful, perhaps, but in a strange way, very human. What the plague revealed, more than anything, was the fragility of order. The systems that had held medieval life together, trade, law, religion, and trust, could all fall apart under pressure. And once they did, it became very clear just how much people relied on each other, whether they wanted to admit it or not. In the chaos, new forms of community also emerged. People formed tight circles of friends or neighbors, caring for one another, sharing what little they had. In some places, women stepped into roles left vacant by the dead running shops, managing property, even practicing medicine. With so many gone, the rules had to bend. And sometimes, in that bending, something new began to take shape. The Black Death was far from over, but already it was doing more than killing. It was changing the way people saw the world, each other, and themselves. And as the bodies were buried and the cities slowly began to breathe again, people looked not only to the heavens, but also to the ground beneath their feet. Because something else was happening, quietly, under the surface, a shift that would remake Europe forever. That part of the story is just ahead. While death visited every doorstep and silence crept through the streets, the people of Europe did something unexpected. They created. Not all of them, of course. Some were far too busy surviving, digging, or praying, but a curious thread of art, story, and superstition began to wind its way through the shadows. It turns out that when the world begins to unravel, the human imagination often rushes to fill the gaps. What began as fear soon became ritual. In cities where the plague raged hardest, processions were held, not always organized by clergy, but by the desperate. Some carried crosses. Others wore costumes meant to scare off evil spirits. If you had wandered through Paris or Siena in the thick of the pandemic, you might have seen masked figures walking barefoot, chanting or moaning, and holding talismans made from bone or metal. You might have also seen merchants selling holy water that looked suspiciously like pond water, or miracle pills that were basically dried herbs and hope. It was a strange time for fashion, too. In some towns, people wore charms around their necks, tiny scrolls with prayers, dried toads, or even fingernails from so-called saints. One Venetian man famously wore a necklace made of garlic, rosary beads, and fish bones. He said it kept his lungs clean. His neighbors mostly just kept their distance. Art itself began to change, and quickly. Before the plague, much of medieval art had focused on saints, heaven, and the glory of the church. But now, painters and sculptors turned their gaze toward death. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, appeared across Europe. These were murals or illustrations showing skeletons, leading people to the grave, not just peasants, but kings, popes, merchants, and children. The message was clear. Death does not care who you are. It comes for everyone, and it might be tapping you on the shoulder even now. What made these images so powerful was not just their message, but their detail. Death was not abstract. It had a face, a grin, a bony hand wrapped around the arm of a once proud nobleman. In some paintings, skeletons played instruments. In others, they danced in lines across the page, dragging the living behind them. It sounds grim, but it was also strangely comforting. If death comes for everyone, then perhaps we are all in this together. Other artists turned to more symbolic works. They painted hourglasses, wilting flowers, or crumbling towers. Some even painted portraits of themselves with death sitting nearby, as if to say, well, at least we are being honest. In manuscripts, tiny illustrations of rats began to appear in the margins. Some scholars think these were just artistic flourishes. Others suspect they were sly references to the thing no one really wanted to name. Theatrical performances, too, took a darker turn. Morality plays became popular stories where characters named greed, pride, or death would walk the stage. The audience was reminded that no matter how much gold you had, you could not bribe your way out of the grave. These plays were not always subtle, but subtlety was in short supply. Even architecture was touched by the plague. Churches built during or shortly after the pandemic often included carvings of skulls, bones, or grim reapers hidden among the saints and angels. In one church in Germany, the pulpit was decorated with a scene of skeletons digging graves while a bishop looked on. It was as if the buildings themselves had become reminders of mortality. And then there was literature. Writers, those resilient observers of chaos, responded in ways both serious and silly. One of the most famous works to emerge from the Black Death was The Decameron, written by Giovanni Boccaccio. In it, a group of young people flee the plague-ridden city of Florence and hide out in a countryside villa where they pass the time by telling stories. These stories are not all about death. In fact, many are romantic, bawdy, or just plain absurd. Boccaccio's message was that even in disaster, people still laugh, still flirt, still live. It was, in a way, an act of rebellion, choosing joy in the face of fear. Other writers took a more solemn approach. Chroniclers like Jean de Venette and Henry Knighton tried to document the horrors around them, writing down how many died, how people behaved, and how the world seemed to darken each day. Their words, while not always precise, provide a window into the emotional weight of the time. Some of them, overwhelmed by what they saw, stopped writing altogether. Superstition, unsurprisingly, surged. When traditional explanations failed, people turned to old tales, folk beliefs, and rumors. Stories spread of people who could see death before it came. Some said animals behaved strangely when the plague was near. Dogs howled more often. Birds refused to sing. Others believed that dreams could predict who would die next. One woman in France claimed that she had dreamed of a great black dog standing outside her door every night until her husband fell ill. After that, she dreamed only silence. One of the more widespread beliefs was that the alignment of the planets had poisoned the air. This idea came from respected medical texts of the time, but it did not stop local folk from taking it several steps further. Some people carried mirrors wrapped in cloth to protect their souls. Others hung mirrors on their walls to deflect the evil eye. It is not clear whether this helped, but it did make for some very shiny living rooms. Yet, for all the odd behavior, there was something deeply human at the heart of these reactions. People were trying to make sense of what could not be explained. They were searching for order in a world that suddenly had none. And while they did not have science in the way we think of it today, they had imagination. They had stories. They had each other. Even as the graves filled and the cities emptied, the creative spirit endured. Artists painted, writers wrote, musicians composed hymns and dirges, not because they thought it would stop the plague, but because it helped them hold on to what was left of the world they had known. Creation became a form of resistance, a quiet defiance. Because if death was going to knock on every door, then perhaps, just perhaps, leaving something behind, a painting, a song, a tale whispered to a child, was the only way to answer. And in the next part of this story, we will begin to look at what was left behind, not just in memory or paint, but in law, language, labor, and life itself. Because once the dust began to settle, the shape of Europe would never be the same. When the plague finally loosened its grip, the world that emerged was not the same one that had come before. It was as if a giant hand had reached down and shaken the map of Europe, scattering people, ideas, and old beliefs like so many dry leaves. The cities were quieter, the fields were emptier, and the survivors, those lucky few who had not been taken, found themselves staring at a world with fewer rules, fewer masters, and fewer reasons to go back to how things had been. It is strange to think of catastrophe as opportunity, but in many ways, that is what the Black Death created. With millions gone, there were jobs unfilled, houses abandoned, and entire villages standing silent. The social pyramid, so carefully constructed over centuries, suddenly developed cracks. Those at the bottom, the peasants, the laborers, the overlooked, were now in short supply. And as any merchant will tell you, when something becomes scarce, its value goes up. Wages rose, slowly at first, then sharply. A plowman who once worked from sunup to sundown for a few coins a week could now demand double or even triple the pay. Landowners, desperate to keep their estates running, had little choice but to agree. In some towns, young workers were chased down the street by rival employers offering bread, meat, and even boots just to get them to sign on. The ruling class, naturally, did not love this. Kings and nobles passed laws to try and freeze wages, insisting that workers accept the same pay they had before the plague. These laws were often ignored. After all, when there are 3 men left who know how to shoe a horse and 30 horses in need of shoes, it is not the horse owners who set the terms. In England, the government issued the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. These were essentially official grumblings disguised as law, trying to stop workers from getting too confident. The results were mixed. Some towns enforced them, others looked the other way. What was clear was that the old system, with its tightly controlled hierarchy and rigid expectations, was wobbling. Peasants began to move more freely. Bound to their land for generations, many now saw a chance to leave, to look for better terms elsewhere. Entire families packed up and left for new towns, new lords, or just new beginnings. The road became a place of change, and with that movement came questions. If a man can choose his work, choose his lord, maybe he can choose other things too, like what to wear, or what to say, or who to listen to. Cities too changed. With fewer mouths to feed, there was more food for those who remained. Bread was cheaper. Meat, once a luxury, became more common. Surviving children inherited larger portions of land. Houses that had once held 10 were now home to 4. Space opened up, literally and figuratively. And with that space came a shift in mindset. People began to think differently about labor, about value, about power. The old assumption that some were born to rule and others to work did not fit as neatly as before. If the world could be turned upside down by a flea on a rat, maybe the ladder of society was not as fixed as the lords liked to think. Religion, too, began to feel the tremors. The church had lost many of its priests and monks. Entire monasteries had vanished. Some churches sat empty for months. The authority of the church, once so firm, began to feel distant. People still prayed. They still believed. But now there was a hesitation, a flicker of doubt. Why had God allowed this? Why had some priests fled while others stayed? And if prayer had not saved their loved ones, what good was it? This was not open rebellion. Not yet. But it planted seeds. In the decades that followed, movements began to stir. Preachers who spoke of a simpler faith, writers who questioned the wealth of bishops. In time, these would grow into full-blown reformations. But for now, it was more like a whisper in the pews. Education took a hit in the short term. Many teachers and scholars had died, and the universities struggled to recover. But over time, something surprising happened. With fewer people competing for entry, more children from merchant and artisan families began to attend schools. Literacy spread. Books were copied and shared. Ideas moved. And as those ideas moved, they collided with new experiences, new doubts, and a fresh awareness that the world was not as stable as it once seemed. Art, as we saw before, had already started to shift during the plague. Afterward, it changed again. There was still death, still skulls and bones and reminders of the grave. But there was also life-tender portraits, detailed landscapes, warm scenes of everyday people. Artists like Giotto in Italy, who had begun painting with a realism unheard of before, now inspired a generation of painters to look at the world not as a symbol but as something worth capturing for its own sake. In many ways, the groundwork for the Renaissance was laid in the dust of the plague, not just because people had more money or more time, but because they had seen what it meant to lose everything. The desire to study the human form, to explore science and reason, to build and create and think, all of it was, in part, a response to that loss. Of course, not all change was dramatic. Some was quietly practical. Cities cleaned their streets more often. Public health ordinances appeared. Bathhouses were rebuilt. Quarantine became a word with meaning, first in Venice, then elsewhere. It was not modern medicine, but it was a beginning, the first few bricks in what would eventually become a more organized effort to prevent disease. And then there was grief, a grief that did not vanish with time but settled into the bones of those who remained. Songs were written, poems whispered, names forgotten. The survivors carried stories that were not just about death, but about endurance, about neighbors who shared bread, about strangers who offered comfort, about laughter that somehow still broke through, even when the world felt broken. The Black Death had taken much, but in doing so, it forced people to rethink nearly everything from who they were to what they could become. It reshaped Europe not through fire or conquest, but through absence, through silence, through the strange, heavy spaces where voices used to be. And in the next chapter, we will explore how this reshaping continued. Because what rose from the ruins was not just a new economy or a new society, it was a new idea of what a human being could do. Even after the worst of the Black Death had passed, its shadow lingered like smoke after a fire. The physical damage was visible: abandoned houses, overgrown fields, smaller congregations in every village church, but beneath all that, something else had shifted. Europe was not just recovering, it was transforming. One of the clearest signs of this change was in how people began to think about work and wealth. Before the plague, the feudal system had locked most peasants into a rigid cycle. You worked the land, gave a portion of your harvest to your lord, and hoped that between bad weather and bad taxes, you could feed your family. Ambition was not really part of the arrangement. But now, with so many gone and so much land left untended, the rules had loosened. A plowman might wake one day and realize that the neighboring field was empty and had been for months. No one had come to claim it, and if he worked it, who would stop him? This shift created a kind of quiet revolution. People moved, they bargained, they took chances. Entire villages sprang up where there had once been only grass. Others faded completely into memory. The nobility understandably panicked. Many of them relied on rents and labor from their estates to maintain their lifestyles. With peasants demanding better pay or walking away altogether, the income dried up. Some lords reduced the size of their households. Others tried to hold on by doubling down on old laws, forcing people back into place. But the tide was turning, and no law could convince a man to accept starvation wages when a town 20 miles away was offering hot bread and clean water. In England, the pressure boiled over. By the year 1381, just a generation after the first wave of plague, the peasants rose. The peasants' revolt, as it came to be called, was not a spontaneous outburst, but a long-simmering result of frustration, inequality, and broken promises. Tax after tax had been levied on the poor, and now the people had begun to see their own worth. They had survived death. They had rebuilt farms and cities. And yet the old burdens remained. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by preachers like John Ball, thousands of peasants marched on London. They demanded lower taxes, fair treatment, and the end of serfdom. For a brief moment, it looked as if they might succeed. The young king met with them. Promises were made. And then, just as quickly, the rebellion was crushed. Tyler was killed during negotiations, and the rebels were scattered. Still, something had changed. The old order had been challenged openly and loudly. Even if the revolt failed in the moment, its echoes remained. Across Europe, similar tensions simmered, sometimes flaring up, sometimes muttering in the background like a low drumbeat. The plague had not just thinned the population, it had broken the spell of inevitability. People had seen the system falter. They had seen lords bury their own. They had seen priests flee and kings grow silent. The illusion of invincibility had been cracked. Meanwhile, in the cities, a new kind of person began to rise: the merchant. Trade had suffered terribly during the plague, but as the years passed, it began to rebound. Ships returned to the seas. Markets reopened, and in places like Florence, Venice, Bruges, and Ghent, trade families built fortunes. They were not born noble, but they became powerful, often more so than those with old titles. Gold, after all, speaks louder than ancestry. These merchants did not just count coins. They built roads and ports. They sponsored artists and architects. They founded schools. Some of them even became political leaders, using wealth to shape policy. This was a new idea that money, not just bloodline, could grant influence. It was not democracy, not yet, but it was a step towards something less feudal, more flexible. Education, too, began to change. With the loss of so many scholars and teachers, universities initially struggled, but over time they recovered and expanded. New ideas flowed in, not just from old Roman and Greek texts, but from the Islamic world, where learning had flourished during Europe's darkest hours. Medicine, astronomy, philosophy, these subjects gained traction. And with more students coming from outside the aristocracy, knowledge started to become a little less exclusive. Books remained expensive, copied slowly by hand, but their value rose. A well-kept book was now as treasured as a jewel. In homes where wealth was growing, so too was a hunger for literacy. People wanted to understand the world that had nearly ended. They wanted to read, to think, to imagine something different. And then there was the church. It still stood, but it stood on uncertain legs. The mass death had left many believers shaken. Questions echoed in the quiet chapels. Why had the innocent died while the wicked lived? Why had prayers gone unanswered? Why had the very people entrusted to guide the faithful sometimes abandoned them? Some sought reform, others drifted away, a few turned to new sects, new ideas, or a more personal connection to faith. In time, these small shifts would grow into movements, some quiet, some loud. But even in the 1400s, you could feel it. The spiritual ground had shifted. It would be easy to say that all of this was inevitable, that Europe was simply on its way toward modernity, and the Black Death just sped things along. But the truth is more complicated. This was not a straight path. It was a scramble, a recovery filled with setbacks and small triumphs. Fields went fallow, then green again. Families moved, rebuilt, vanished. Cities grew, then burned, then grew again. People adapted not because they wanted to evolve, but because they had to. The world had changed. They were just trying to keep up. And sometimes, even after all the grief and confusion, there were moments of wonder. A child born after the plague might look around and see more space, more food, and a sky a little more open than it had been for their parents. A merchant might see opportunity in a port that had once been closed. A builder might raise a church not just in praise of heaven, but as a symbol that life, though fragile, continues. In these moments, something new stirred not hope in a loud, triumphant way, but something quieter, like a breath after a long silence. The Black Death had taken, but it had also revealed. In the next part, we will look deeper into that legacy, not just what was lost, but what was born, a new kind of thinking, a new kind of art, a new kind of world emerging from the ashes, still finding its voice. Something strange happens after everything falls apart. When the ground stops shaking, when the last body is buried, when the air is no longer heavy with the stench of death, the silence settles in. And in that silence, people begin to think, not just about what they lost, but about what still might be possible. After the Black Death, Europe found itself standing in the middle of that silence, blinking in the sunlight, unsure whether to mourn or to begin again. One of the most powerful shifts happened not in the palace or the cathedral, but in the mind. For centuries, the dominant view of the world had been shaped by the church, by tradition, and by an unshakable sense that the structure of life was permanent. Kings ruled because they were born to rule. Priests spoke because they were chosen to speak. The poor labored because someone had to. The order of things was thought to be fixed, ordained by heaven, and mirrored on earth. But the plague had shattered that illusion. Suddenly, entire monasteries were empty. Bishops, lords, and even popes had died alongside beggars. Fields that had been tightly managed were now open to negotiation. Trade had paused, then reshaped itself. The world had broken, and then, piece by piece, it had put itself back together differently. Out of that rebuilding came questions. What if life was not only about waiting for heaven? What if the world itself was worth studying, worth understanding, even worth enjoying? These were not loud questions at first. They came in the form of a merchant sponsoring a painter, or a scholar asking to see ancient texts that had sat unopened for centuries, or a young man reading a poem and wondering why it spoke to him so clearly. This quiet curiosity began to swell into something larger, a new way of seeing. Historians would later call it humanism, a way of thinking that focused not only on God and salvation, but on people, nature, beauty, and reason. It was not a rejection of faith, far from it. Many of the early humanists were deeply religious, but they wanted to explore the full range of human experience. They wanted to understand the body, the mind, the stars, and the soul. Not as pieces of a puzzle to be endured, but as wonders to be studied. In Italy, where the plague had struck early and hard, this new energy began to bloom. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan were not just recovering, they were thriving. Wealth from trade poured in. So did ideas. Merchants, newly rich and eager to leave a mark on history, began to fund artists and architects, writers and scientists. They built libraries, chapels, and palaces. They paid for paintings not just of saints and angels, but of real people with real emotions. The art that followed was unlike anything Europe had seen in centuries. Painters like Giotto had already begun to show more realistic figures before the plague, but now the floodgates opened. Faces became expressive. Bodies had weight and motion. Light and shadow played across walls and skin. These changes were not just technical, they were philosophical. To paint a human being with care was to say that human beings mattered. And it was not just painting. Literature, too, began to shift. Writers like Petrarch in Italy and Chaucer in England began to focus more on the individual voice. Their work captured personal thought, love, doubt, humor, and sorrow. The characters they created felt more alive, more complicated, more familiar. It was as if the writers were no longer speaking for the church or the crown, but for themselves and for others like them. Education changed with this new outlook. Instead of focusing solely on theology and logic, schools began to teach grammar, rhetoric, history, poetry, and moral philosophy, the so-called Studia Humanitatis. Latin and Greek texts were dusted off and read not just for religious lessons, but for their insight into politics, ethics, and the human heart. Ancient thinkers like Cicero and Plato found new readers. Their ideas sparked debate and imagination. Printing would not arrive for several more decades, but even without the press, ideas began to move faster. Students traveled between universities. Letters were exchanged across borders. Art was carried on wagons and shown to crowds in cathedrals and city halls. Knowledge, once hoarded by a few, began to trickle into the wider world. And beneath it all, there was still the memory of death. The art and thought of this new age did not forget the past. It carried it. In frescoes, skeletons still danced. In poetry, Graves still spoke. The humanists did not pretend the plague had not happened. They simply refused to let it be the final word. In fact, for many people, the plague had shown that life could end at any moment without warning or reason, and that realization gave the present a kind of urgency. If death could not be escaped, perhaps it could be outlived in a book, in a building, in a brushstroke. This was not the Renaissance yet, at least not in full. That would come in the following century, with names like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Galileo. But the seeds were here planted in plague-ravaged soil, watered by grief, and pushed into bloom by the simple desire to understand what it meant to be alive. Even the most practical parts of life reflected this shift. Medicine, long based on guesswork and ancient authority, began to face new questions. If disease could kill in such vast numbers, should it not be studied more seriously? Physicians started recording symptoms with more detail. They questioned old theories. Some even began to dissect human bodies, carefully and quietly, often at night. It was controversial, but curiosity does not ask for permission. Cities rebuilt with a sharper eye toward health. Streets were widened. Sewage systems improved. Quarantine became a policy rather than a desperate guess. In Venice, ships were required to wait for 40 days before passengers could disembark. The word quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, was born from this rule. It was one of the few things from this time that managed to be both practical and poetic. So here stood Europe, scarred but standing, looking forward with cautious hope. People were still burying the dead, still mourning lost children and lovers, but they were also building schools, writing plays, planting gardens, mixing paints, telling stories. They were not pretending the plague had never come, but they were no longer letting it speak alone. In the next part, we will step further into this changed world, not just in the churches and courts, but in the homes and hearts of the people who now had to carry their history forward. Because if there was one thing the Black Death made clear, it was this: you cannot always choose what happens to you, but you can choose what happens next. As Europe moved forward, carrying both the burden and the lessons of the Black Death, the rhythms of daily life began to find a new beat. The church bells rang again. Markets reopened. Children were born into a world that no longer remembered the days before the plague. But even in their laughter, there was a weight beneath the surface, a kind of inherited memory, the kind that settles deep in the bones of a society. People had changed, not just in their routines, but in their outlook. Life, always fleeting, now seemed more fragile and more precious, and perhaps more negotiable. The rules of the past, those quiet expectations about birth, labor, and loyalty, no longer held the same grip. If half your village had vanished in one season, who had time to worry about which family had owned what land 3 generations ago? The family itself had changed. In many cases, there were fewer members to share a hearth with. Households grew smaller, but inheritance grew larger. Children who survived inherited land, money, tools, and responsibilities far earlier than expected. Widows ran farms. Orphans were raised by cousins or, in some cases, not at all. Communities adapted, sometimes beautifully, sometimes messily. Women, especially, found themselves navigating new spaces. The shortage of labor gave rise to opportunity. In towns, women opened shops, managed property, and handled business that had once been reserved for their husbands or brothers. In the countryside, they worked the fields, kept the ledgers, and negotiated rents with local lords. Some were respected for their resilience. Others were quietly resented for their independence. A few were accused of witchcraft, because nothing frightens a nervous man like a woman who knows how to use a ledger. Even marriage shifted. With so many deaths, the pool of eligible partners had shrunk. People married younger or older, or for reasons less rooted in family alliances and more in survival. A good cook, a strong back, or a kind heart suddenly mattered more than a large dowry or a noble name. In the wake of loss, people wanted comfort, stability, and someone who could build a roof before winter came. In the towns and cities, guilds began to flex their muscles. These were the associations of craftsmen, the bakers, weavers, stonemasons, and tanners who organized trade, upheld standards, and trained apprentices. After the plague, they became more important than ever. With fewer skilled workers around, guild members could command higher prices and greater respect. But with that power came internal tension. Who could join? Who could lead? Who decided what counted as good work? These questions began to stretch the tight cords of tradition. Younger workers pushed for access. Foreigners arrived in towns and asked to be included. In some places, the guilds opened up. In others, they doubled down, becoming more exclusive. But everywhere, the sense that society was in motion could not be ignored. Meanwhile, governments found themselves both weaker and more important. The plague had shown just how vulnerable kingdoms really were. In some cases, entire courts had been wiped out. Royal advisors were replaced. Tax systems had to be rebuilt. Armies were thinned by death, disbanded, or rebuilt from scratch. And yet, people turned to rulers more than before. They wanted order, stability, a plan for the next time. This tension between weakened power and growing expectation created a new kind of political energy. Kings and princes began to centralize authority, building bureaucracies to better collect taxes and enforce law. But at the same time, towns and cities demanded more say in how they were governed. Some formed councils. Others negotiated charters. It was not democracy, but it was not the same old feudalism either. In the countryside, the physical landscape shifted too. With fewer people to farm, large estates were often broken up or consolidated. Lords who could no longer manage their land sold parcels to free tenants. Forests regrew. Fields were left fallow. Sheep farming rose in popularity, especially in England, where wool became a booming export. As one chronicler wryly noted, there are now more sheep than men. With economic change came new wealth. Not for everyone, of course, but for some, the post-plague world offered real prosperity. A butcher who had survived might now own 2 shops instead of 1. A mason might be paid in coin rather than food. A merchant might see his trading network expand across the sea. And with wealth came new habits. People bought finer clothes. They built larger homes. They commissioned paintings, not just of saints, but of themselves. This rising class merchants, artisans, and professionals began to see themselves not as peasants or nobles, but as something in between, something new. They valued education, invested in their children, and began to think generationally. You could say the middle class was being born not with a bang, but with a ledger book and a sturdy pair of shoes. But even in prosperity, people did not forget. The cemeteries were still there. So were the empty chairs. In some places, old buildings were left untouched, preserved as silent memorials. Songs were sung to remember the lost. In others, the memory of the plague was wrapped in superstition. Certain places were avoided, certain herbs were planted. Certain phrases were whispered when a cough was heard in the wrong season. And yet, life pushed forward. Festivals returned. Children played. The rhythms of sowing and harvest resumed. People smiled again cautiously at first, then freely. They told stories, some of which were true and some of which were absolutely not. One tale in northern Germany claimed that a man had outwitted the plague by living in a wine barrel for 2 years and only coming out at night. A popular local dance was supposedly based on his story. Whether or not he ever existed hardly mattered. He had become part of the larger truth that people would always find a way to endure. The Black Death had not just ended lives. It had unraveled a way of being. But from that unraveling came possibility, a loosening of old chains, a shift in who could speak, who could learn, and who could dream. It was slow, uneven, and not always fair, but it was real. And in the next and final part of this series, we will look at what all of it meant not just then, but now. Because the story of the Black Death is not just a story of what was lost. It is a story of what humanity found in the silence that followed. By the time the 14th century gave way to the 15th, Europe had changed. The Black Death had swept through with no regard for station, piety, or preparation, and the people left behind had been forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. From how they worked to how they prayed, how they ruled to how they dreamed, the world that rose after the plague did not simply resume the past, it reshaped it. There was no grand announcement. No cathedral bells rang to declare that a new age had begun. Life resumed quietly, piece by piece. A field that had gone wild was cut and planted again. A family who had lost 3 sons welcomed a daughter into the world. A cobbler reopened his shop and noticed his hands had stiffened from months of grief. There were no fireworks, only breath. The first normal breath in what felt like years. And that breath carried meaning. The Black Death had killed, but it had also uncovered. It revealed the strength of people who kept going when everything told them to stop. It revealed the weakness of systems built only to serve the few. It revealed the hunger people had not just for food and shelter, but for knowledge, for beauty, for meaning. And slowly those realizations took root. In the cities, art flourished. Florence, devastated in the early years of the plague, became a jewel of the Renaissance. Painters captured not only saints and martyrs, but mothers and children, workers and lovers. Their faces were not idealized. They were real, human, flawed, alive. Writers told stories that celebrated wit, questioned authority, and explored the soul. Music shifted from chant to harmony. Even architecture began to reflect a new balance between form and function, earth and sky. Education changed too. Universities rebuilt themselves and grew. More people learned to read. More people questioned what they read. The world grew larger in the mind before it ever expanded across oceans. Ideas that had been buried with the dead were dusted off and studied anew. Old Greek and Roman texts were translated, debated, and taught. The seeds of modern science, philosophy, and politics were quietly planted in classrooms and libraries that smelled of parchment and ink. The church, though bruised, endured, but it now faced a more inquisitive flock, people still believed, still prayed, but many of them wanted more from their faith than fear and mystery. They asked sharper questions. Some still turned to rituals and relics, others turned inward, seeking a God they could speak to without a priest in between. These small shifts in spiritual focus would eventually lead to reform movements. But in the years immediately after the plague, they mostly led to reflection, a slow turning of the soul towards something deeper. Governments, too, evolved. Kings who had once ruled by divine right now needed better administrators, stronger cities, and in some cases, the support of common people. Parliament in England grew more influential. City-states in Italy crafted their own laws. Trade expanded. Diplomacy improved. Even warfare, gruesome as it remained, became more strategic, more calculated. The chaos of the plague had shown that leadership was not simply about inheritance, it was about adaptability. But for all these large movements, it was the smaller things that often mattered most. A baker who gave bread to a neighbor's child, a stonemason who carved a tiny flower into the corner of a window frame because beauty, he believed, was its own kind of prayer. A midwife who stayed during the plague and became a legend in her village, not because she saved everyone, but because she stayed. Memory played a strange role. Some wanted to forget, to erase the years of death and pain. Others built monuments, wrote songs, or named children after the lost. The grief did not vanish. It lingered, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in silence between sentences, but it also gave weight to joy. A warm meal, a new friendship, a wedding, these things were no longer taken for granted. They were victories. As the generations passed, the direct memory of the Black Death faded. The plague became story, then legend, then distant history. But the changes it sparked remained, the new social mobility, the shifting religious ideas, the flourishing of arts and learning, the awareness that systems could break, and when they did, people could change them. It was not a golden age. It was not without cruelty or conflict. But it was something new, and it was built not from triumph, but from survival. Even centuries later, echoes of the Black Death still hum through our world, in the ways we handle disease, in the ways we question power, in our obsession with time and legacy, bones and memory, in every painting that shows not just a face, but a soul behind it, in every song that celebrates life because we know how easily it can be lost. The plague did not end the world, but it did force it to look in the mirror. And for all the horror it unleashed, it also uncovered something extraordinary, the resilience of people who refused to let fear have the final word. In every village that rebuilt, in every field that was planted again, in every hand that reached out instead of pulling away, the message was clear. Life goes on. Not as it was, but as it must. Not untouched, but unbroken. Not perfect, but still beautiful. And sometimes in the quiet after disaster, it is that very fragility that teaches us how to live more fully than we ever did before. This is how the story ends, not with a final death toll or a closing door, but with a new beginning already underway. 1,000 years later, we are still telling the tale. Not because we are trapped in the past, but because it reminds us of what we carry forward. We carry loss. We carry change. And we carry the unshakable truth that even in the darkest chapter, the human story goes on.